teeth were a bit bigger than the other ones, but my parents could just be so mean about that, and they made me feel so insecure. Well, my grandparents were always so accepting and open, very open.
Yeah, yeah. How was it for them to navigate those differences with your parents? Because they're raising you with the Dutch values and the norms and the cultural norms, and they were right next door to your parents. They were basically like, you imagine that you're living together and you're just sharing, a backyard or something. How did all of that kind of play out?
Yeah, it's we were actually sharing a backyard because we didn't have a fence. So
So it really was it's effectively like a family unit.
yeah, it was like a family unit, basically. Yeah. But I have some great examples actually to explain how that situation was because um, in Vietnamese culture, it's quite normal to hit your children if they do something wrong. You can just hit them and that's okay because, what else would you do? Why would you talk about stuff like that's not really seen as a solution? And my Dutch grandparents were absolutely shocked. They were like, how can you just hit your children like that? And my parents and my grandparents actually had a fight about that. Well, actually, my dad and my grandparents had a fight about that because my dad, he just screamed like, this is our culture. And in our culture, this is normal. And this is what we do. And my grandma had tears to her eyes because I think all of this happened when they were having coffee on Sunday, as they would usually do. And I think something happened, and my dad would hit me. And I think my grandma saw that, and she was just so shocked. And she decided that she wanted to say something about that because that's what Dutch people do. They're very direct. If they don't like something, they would just tell so. So my grandma told my dad, like, why are you doing this? This is not normal. This is not how you treat your children. And I think that was really difficult for my dad because, of course, he grew up Vietnamese and he is now in this country where they have different norms and values.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for my grandparents, it was really hard to see because they could say something about it, but that's it. They didn't have any other power to change it because they were still my parents.
Mm-hmm. I imagine that even if they weren't able to directly change something in the moment, that because there was this different kind of input that you wouldn't have had if you hadn't lived next door to them or if they hadn't been involved in your life, that it might have caused your parents to reflect a bit afterwards. And, if it were to happen again and again in different circumstances, maybe there would be something to make them think a little bit about what the differences were. Not to say that, there's one right way or one wrong way. I think that this whole discussion about third culture, about, cross-cultural values is really interesting because cultural systems evolve within cultures and everyone does things for a reason. That's something that I'm learning as well, because of course from a Chinese background, it's very similar to a Vietnamese background. Everything that you said, I was like, and I didn't have Dutch grandparents. I didn't have Canadian grandparents living next to me. So I didn't have those kinds of direct inputs the same way as you did. And I also went through like the whole kind of, what's the problem with my family? How come they're treating me so much different than how I see my friends' parents treating them? And which culture is better? And, like what's wrong with Asian culture? I thought a lot about those things. I talked a lot about those things. And these days I'm really trying to understand how things seem to be right when you have the right context for them. And I wonder, in Vietnam, when the parents are hitting their kids, but all the parents are hitting their kids, and so that really is the normal thing, does it feel as traumatizing when that happens? Because you just talk to your friends, you're like, yeah, we're all getting beaten.
Yeah, actually, talking to a lot of other Asian friends right now, I see that it was not just my parents. I see that it was really all Asian parents that are doing this. And I don't think it's okay. But I do see now that my parents also see that it was wrong. And they also see that talking works much better than just hitting your children. Because in the end, if you don't go to the root of the problem, you won't solve it. And you're not getting to the root of the problem if you just hit your kids. Because you're just, yeah.
Yeah, it's trying to address the symptom of something else that's going on deeper.
Yeah. And on the other hand, I also somehow don't blame my parents because they are doing, that's what I see now though. But back then I didn't, but now I do. They were also doing the best they can and the best that they learned from their parents. So in some way, I also don't want to blame them, but I'm happy that they see now that this might have not been the right way.
Yeah. And I think that's a really mature conclusion to have come to, or maybe it's a process that we're all kind of working through, which is we can only do what we know. And what we know is determined by the environment that we live in and the resources that we've had access to and how we've been treated when we were growing up. And so there are all these like innate things that you don't ever really question until you might come into a contrast when you go to a different place or when you encounter, other parenting styles. Tell me about some of the other things that growing up was like, so you were a minority, a visible minority growing up in the Netherlands, but you're Dutch, you're completely integrated into Dutch culture. Did you feel Dutch while growing up?
I feeling Dutch came with phases in my life, I think, and I feel like the first couple of years I felt very Dutch because I was surrounded by white people. My grandparents were white people, and I just grew up as a normal Dutch kid, even though there was a difference because my parents were Vietnamese. So sometimes I would learn something about Vietnamese culture. But as I became a little bit older, I saw that I was different, and people started treating me differently, and people also started bullying me by how I looked because I didn't have blonde hair or blue eyes, and I also didn't want it to be linked with being Vietnamese because it was something that made me look different than the rest of my whole class or the friends that I had. It was quite hard because like when you're younger, it's so nice to see a role model of to see a big diversity in, let's say, for example, commercials, because that makes you feel accepted and that makes you feel seen. But as a young child, at one point I didn't feel seen at all, and the bullying that was really bad. And I would come home from school and tell my parents that these kids at school would bully me, and they are saying, like, calling me Chinese and saying that my eyes are so chinky and that I don't look normal. And I would tell all of these things to my parents, and my parents would just say, "Oh, you shouldn't say something back. Just keep quiet. Like, that's the best thing to do. Like, just keep quiet." And by saying that to me, I felt like I was not heard and I was not seen, and that my parents were not taking me seriously. And then I would go to my grandparents and I would tell my grandparents that this was happening. And they were like, "You have to say something back. You have to say that this is not okay and you have to
Mm-hmm.
stand up for yourself. You really need to do that. So next time someone says something to you, just start doing that." And I actually started doing that, and people stopped saying all these things to me. But this feeling of not being heard and not being seen, it still remained in me
Mm-hmm.
after some years.
I think about why the advice was so different. And I wonder if confrontation was so discouraged by your parents because confrontation with authorities or people who were picking on you back in Vietnam could have resulted in something really tragic. You could have been beaten, you might have been killed. And so I wonder if the advice to just keep quiet and don't do anything, it comes from that kind of self-preservation to be like, you know what, just let the person have his way. It's better that you come out of this alive than making a stand and possibly not being able to come out of it. Whereas in Dutch culture, totally different circumstance. It's not being ruled by an authoritarian regime, and there's a lot more civil society, and it's just that's just what you would do in the Dutch society. So it makes sense to me that they would have taught you that. But I can imagine if they had been in Vietnam and that was the advice they had given, then it wouldn't have been appropriate.
I definitely agree, and I think that somehow, because my mom, she always tried to make me feel better when I came home crying and all these things, but it was mostly my dad, and I think he was still in this survival mode, still maybe what has had like back, in Vietnam, as you're saying. So I think that actually might be true. Yeah.
And so you said that feeling Dutch came in phases. How did things change?
So in the beginning, I felt really Dutch because all of my friends were like that. But at one point, I started being bullied, and that made me aware of the fact that I am Dutch, but I'm also something else. But the only frame of reference I had with Vietnamese culture was, of course, my living, my home situation, my family situation. And that wasn't that great. So for a long time in my life, I didn't want to know anything about Vietnamese culture, about the traditions, the norms, the values that they have, because I saw it as something really bad and as something that really hurt me, also made me somehow traumatized. So I didn't want it to be linked to that at all. But at one point, I started to become really interested in the culture, and I saw that what makes me different makes me unique, and it makes me stand out as well. So I started seeing it as something to be proud of, and that led to me doing a lot of like research and starting to ask my parents a lot of questions about how Vietnamese culture is and how my family is living out there. It's really funny because when I look back at it, I see these clear phases of being somehow in denial and then going from denial to accepting it. And I think right now I'm at this part where I'm really owning it.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about how it came to you and Orihana to decide to make this documentary together.
Right. So I am at fashion school right now, and at one point my flexible program started, and I wanted to follow this arts minor at the Arts Academy, and I did that. And basically, our assignment was to create a product that could be anything. And that was around the time that I started doing a lot of research on the Vietnam War, because I wanted to understand what had happened and what kind of impact it had on the people there and even my own family. And I watched this really long and extensive Netflix documentary on the Vietnam War. And that's around the same time that I started to ask my father a lot of questions. And it was really funny because normally when I talk with my dad on the phone, we literally talk for 1 minute and it's basically, hey, how are you? Yeah, I'm good. How's school? Yeah, it's good. Oh, okay, well, say hi to mom.
I can relate.
Yeah, that's basically how our conversations would go. But then I was watching, like it was over the summer, and I called him and I asked him, like, hey, dad, like, I'm watching this documentary and I'm seeing this American perspective, and I was just wondering about your perspective. And then we talked for 20 minutes on the phone,
Wow.
which is super long,
Yeah.
for us. That's
Yeah.
super long for us. And then I was like, okay, so this is interesting. I want to know more about this. And I realized, like, okay, I should do something that's personal, but also has a big impact on society nowadays. And that's how I realized that I wanted to do a documentary about the Vietnam War and about how it has affected my family and everyone nowadays, like in society. So I met Orihana about 2 years ago, I think, or even longer. And we met somewhere very randomly on a set. It was a recording of a music video from this Dutch rap group. And I don't know, we just started talking, and she was so incredibly nice. And I instantly felt a connection that whole day long. And
we were hanging around like we were friends for 10 years. Like we were just buddies. It was so weird. It was so weird. It was such a very, very strong, impulsive, because I saw her sitting there. Wow, she's really pretty. There's something about this girl. Shut up, Ori. Don't. And then, like 5 seconds after that, she was like, "Hi," and I was like, oh, "Yes." And we were just, I don't know, like the dynamic duo of the day.
Yeah, we were really hitting it off, and I loved it. I just felt this energy, and I was like, "Okay, this is so nice." So when I decided that I wanted to do a documentary, I was like, okay, because I had no experience in creating a documentary at all. And then I was like, wait. And I remember that Orihana told me that she's doing production and direction and editing and all of these amazing things. So I literally sent her a text and I was like, can I call you? Because I have this idea.
Oh, yeah.
And I called her, and then I basically pitched it like really quickly. And she was like, yes, I want to do this. I want to do this. And I was like, oh my God, amazing.
And then we met at the school where I dropped out of. I dropped out of the school where Yennhi did that arts academy. I dropped out of it because I was like, I can't do this. So it's the most funny,